The stars looked different from the command deck of the Valiant Dawn. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation window, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace rush past. Behind him, his soldiers were settling into their new quarters on the massive alien warship. Everything felt strange and unfamiliar, but that was the reality now. Humanity had finally been accepted into the Galactic Union, and Earth's warriors were needed on the front lines. Jake had served 15 years in the Marine Corps before this assignment. He had fought in 3 different conflicts on Earth and thought he had seen everything, but nothing prepared him for working alongside aliens. The Thraxians were the dominant military force in this sector, and Jake's battalion of 200 human soldiers would be serving under their command. The briefing room was enormous, designed for beings much larger than humans. The Thraxians stood nearly 7 feet tall, with reptilian features and scales that changed colors. Jake had learned that the color shifts indicated their emotional states, though he was still learning what each color meant. Right now, most of the Thraxian officers showed pale blue scales, which apparently meant professional neutrality. Commander Vexral entered the room, and every Thraxian snapped to attention. The commander was impressive even by his species standards, with dark green scales marked by white scars from countless battles. His eyes were golden and sharp, missing nothing as he surveyed the assembled troops. "Welcome to the Valiant Dawn," Vexral said through his translator device. The words came out in perfect English, though there was a slight mechanical quality to them. "We are honored to have humanity join our fight against the Scriven Horde. Your species has shown courage in defending your own world. Now you will learn what it means to fight among the stars." Jake noticed the subtle condescension in those words. The Thraxians had been fighting in space for 3 centuries. Humanity had barely left its own solar system before first contact. The aliens saw humans as brave but primitive, like children playing at war. Lieutenant Amy Carter sat beside Jake, taking notes on her tablet. She was his second in command, smart and capable, with a sharp tactical mind. She had graduated top of her class at the academy and volunteered for this assignment. Next to her was Sergeant Kyle Bennett, a veteran with 12 years of combat experience and more scars than he liked to count. The 3 of them formed the core leadership of the human contingent. The briefing covered standard procedures, ship protocols, and the basics of Scriven tactics. The enemy was an insectoid species that fought with overwhelming numbers and complete disregard for individual survival. They were driven by hive intelligence and seemed incapable of surrender or retreat. The war had been going on for 8 years, and the Galactic Union was slowly losing ground. "Your quarters are on Deck 7, Vexral continued. "Training facilities are on Deck 9. You will integrate with our existing combat units over the next 3 weeks. We will evaluate your capabilities and assign you appropriate roles." After the briefing ended, the Thraxian officers approached to introduce themselves. Most were polite but distant. They asked questions about human physiology and combat experience, treating the humans more like interesting specimens than fellow warriors. Jake kept his expression neutral and answered professionally, but he could feel his soldiers' frustration building. The next few days were difficult. The human soldiers tried to adapt to life aboard an alien vessel designed for beings much larger than them. The chairs were too big, the doors were too high, and the gravity was set slightly heavier than Earth normal. Everything required extra effort. The food dispensers offered nutrition paste that was technically edible for humans, but tasted like cardboard mixed with metal shavings. Training exercises revealed the technological gap between species. The Thraxians used energy weapons that could cut through steel like paper. Their armor was lightweight but incredibly strong. Grown from some kind of organic crystal, they moved with practiced efficiency, each soldier knowing exactly where to be and what to do. Compared to them, the humans with their projectile weapons and composite armor looked primitive. But Jake noticed something the Thraxians seemed to miss. His soldiers were adapting faster than expected. They studied the aliens' movements, learned their tactics, and started finding ways to contribute. Corporal Lisa Hayes figured out how to override the safety protocols on the training weapons to increase their power output. Private Danny Wright discovered that human flexibility allowed them to take cover in spaces too small for Thraxians. Slowly, grudgingly, the humans were finding their place. The cultural differences caused friction. During a rest period, Amy mentioned that human soldiers often drew inspiration from historical battles and legendary warriors. She told a story about the Marines at Chosin Reservoir, surrounded by enemy forces in freezing weather, fighting their way out against impossible odds. The human soldiers listened with quiet respect. They knew these stories. They had grown up with them. Several Thraxian warriors had gathered to listen as well. When Amy finished, they made a clicking sound that the translators rendered as laughter. Their scales flickered with colors that meant amusement and mild contempt. "You tell stories of past battles to motivate current soldiers?" one Thraxian asked. "Your species uses fictional narratives to encourage combat behavior?" "They're not fictional," Amy replied, keeping her voice level. "These battles really happened. We remember them to honor the sacrifice and learn from their courage." The Thraxian scales brightened with more amusement. "But the warriors you describe are long dead. Their specific circumstances will never repeat. What tactical value does this have? You should study actual combat data and proven strategies, not waste time on emotional stories." Jake saw Kyle's hands curl into fists. Other human soldiers were bristling at the casual dismissal of their traditions. He stood quickly, catching Kyle's eye and shaking his head slightly. "Not here, not now. They were guests on this ship, and they needed to prove themselves before they could afford conflicts. Different species have different methods," Jake said diplomatically. "We're here to learn from each other." Vexerol appeared in the doorway, his scales shifting to a darker blue that meant displeasure. "Is there a problem here, Captain Morrison?" "No, sir. Just a cultural exchange. We were discussing how different species approach combat training." The commander's golden eyes swept across the assembled troops. "The Thraxian Legion operates on logic and proven doctrine. We have 3 centuries of successful military operations. Emotional appeals and mythological thinking have no place in modern warfare. Your species will need to adapt to our methods if you wish to survive." He turned and left, followed by the other Thraxian officers. Jake heard muffled clicking sounds that might have been more laughter. When they were gone, Kyle spat on the deck floor. "That condescending piece of—" "Enough," Jake said quietly. "They think we're primitive. Fine, let them think that. We'll show them what humans can do when it matters." Amy nodded, though her jaw was tight with anger. "We've faced worse than mockery. Remember why we're here. The Scriven are spreading across the galaxy. If we don't stop them out here, eventually they'll reach Earth. Our families, our world. That's what matters." The human soldiers settled down, but the damage was done. They felt disrespected and underestimated. The Thraxians saw them as brave but foolish, courageous but ultimately inferior. It was a wound to their pride that wouldn't heal easily. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked the empty corridors of the ship, thinking about the challenge ahead. His soldiers were good, the best Earth had to offer. But would that be enough? The Thraxians had centuries of experience and technology that seemed like magic. Humanity was the newcomer, the primitive species that had barely discovered faster-than-light travel. He passed by the ship's observation deck and saw a few of his soldiers there, looking out at the stars. They were young, most of them in their 20s, and they had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never see Earth again. They believed in something bigger than themselves. They carried forward the traditions of every warrior who had come before them, from ancient Spartans to modern soldiers. That was humanity's strength, though the aliens couldn't see it yet. Jake joined them at the window. Together they watched the endless stars, each one representing systems and worlds they might have to fight for. The war was real, the enemy was deadly, and the stakes were higher than anything humanity had faced before. They would have to prove themselves not with words, but with action. They would have to show the Galactic Union what humans were capable of when everything was on the line. The chance would come soon enough. The valiant Dawn was heading toward the front lines where the Scriven attacks were most intense. There, in the fire of real combat, humanity would either prove itself or be destroyed trying. Jake preferred it that way. Talk was cheap. Battle would tell the truth. The alarm woke Jake from a restless sleep. Red lights flashed throughout the ship as the emergency broadcast echoed through the corridors. All combat personnel were ordered to report immediately to the deployment bays. This was not a drill. The Scriven had attacked a mining colony on Theta Centauri IV, and the situation was desperate. Jake reached the briefing room in under 3 minutes, still pulling on his combat vest. His battalion was already assembling, faces tense but focused. The Thraxian troops moved with calm efficiency, checking their weapons and armor with practiced ease. Commander Vexrol stood at the tactical display, his scales dark red with battle readiness. "The colony has approximately 1,200 civilians," Vexrol explained, pointing at the three-dimensional map. "The Scriven force numbers at least 3,000 combat forms. Standard protocol requires we wait for fleet reinforcements, which will arrive in 6 hours. By then, everyone on that planet will be dead." Jake stepped forward. "Sir, request permission to deploy immediately with my battalion." Vexrol's scales flickered with surprise and something else, maybe doubt. "Captain Morrison, I appreciate your eagerness, but the tactical situation is unfavorable. The Scriven have numerical superiority and defensive positions. A premature assault could result in complete loss of your forces. If we wait 6 hours, those civilians have no chance at all," Jake replied. "My people are ready to go now." "We can buy time until the main fleet arrives." The commander studied Jake for a long moment. His golden eyes seemed to be calculating odds, weighing risks against potential gains. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I will commit 1 company of Thoraxian shock troops to support your assault. But I will command this operation personally. Your troops follow my orders exactly. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The drop pods were cramped metal coffins designed for Thoraxian physiology. The humans had to squeeze into them, carrying their weapons tight against their bodies. Jake felt the familiar pre-combat tension settling over him. His heart rate increased, his senses sharpened, and all the training from years of service kicked in automatically. Around him, his soldiers were going through their own rituals. Some prayed silently. Others checked their weapons one more time. All of them knew what they were heading into. The drop was violent. The pod screamed through the atmosphere at incredible speeds, protected by energy shields that turned the air around them into superheated plasma. Jake felt like he was being crushed by an enormous weight. Then the pod hit the ground hard, the restraints released automatically, and the door blew open. He rolled out into chaos. The mining colony was a collection of prefabricated structures built into the side of a rocky crater. Smoke and fire filled the air. The sound of weapons fire was constant, a roaring thunder that made communication difficult. And everywhere, swarming over the buildings like a living tide, were the Scriven. Jake had seen pictures and training videos, but nothing prepared him for the reality. The Scriven looked like enormous insects, each one the size of a large dog, with 6 legs and mandibles that dripped with corrosive acid. They moved with terrible speed and coordination, responding to some invisible hive command. Their carapaces were dark and shiny, reflecting the fires burning around the colony. "Form up," Jake shouted into his comm. "Delta Squad left flank. Echo Squad right flank. Maintain fire discipline and watch your spacing." His soldiers moved into position with practiced efficiency. The Thoraxians deployed nearby, their energy weapons cutting bright lines through the swarm of enemies. Vexrol was coordinating the defense, his voice calm and precise as he directed fire to the most critical threats. The Scriven charged with no fear and no hesitation. Jake opened fire with his rifle, the armor-piercing rounds punching through chitin and dropping enemies with each burst. But for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. They were endless, a tide of claws and acid and rage. Sergeant Kyle Bennett was leading a squad to secure the main administration building where most civilians had taken shelter. He moved fast, his people following close behind. The Scriven had broken through the building's defenses and were trying to force their way inside. Kyle didn't hesitate. He charged straight at the enemy position, firing as he ran. "Grenades!" he shouted. 3 explosions ripped through the Scriven cluster, clearing a path. Kyle and his squad pushed through, fighting hand-to-hand when necessary. They reached the building entrance and established a defensive perimeter. The civilians were terrified but alive. On the other side of the colony, Corporal Lisa Hayes had spotted a problem. The Scriven were coming through a natural tunnel system that connected to the crater. The tunnel was narrow, perfect for a choke point, but someone would need to get down there and hold it. Lisa made her decision instantly. "Morrison, this is Hayes. I'm taking position in Tunnel 7. Going to slow them down." "Negative, Hayes. Too dangerous alone. Wait for support. No time, sir. They're coming through by the hundreds. If I don't stop them now, they'll flank our whole position." Jake wanted to order her back, but he knew she was right. "Do it. I'm sending reinforcements as soon as I can." Lisa grabbed a mining laser that had been abandoned nearby. The massive industrial tool was designed for cutting through solid rock. She dragged it into position at the tunnel entrance, set it to continuous beam, and locked the trigger. The laser activated with a brilliant blue light, cutting across the tunnel at chest height for the Scriven. The first wave of enemies ran straight into the beam. It sliced through them like they were made of paper. Bodies fell in pieces, blocking the tunnel temporarily. More Scriven came, trying to climb over their dead, and the laser cut them down too. Lisa held her position, manually adjusting the angle to catch every attacker. The heat was incredible. The smell of burning chitin filled her nose and throat. "Hayes, what's your status?" Jake's voice in her comm. "Still here, sir. They keep coming, but the laser is holding them." She didn't mention that enemy acid had splashed her arm, burning through the armor and eating into her skin. The pain was intense, but she could deal with it later. Right now, the mission mattered more. The battle raged for 2 hours. The Thoraxians fought with impressive discipline, their energy weapons and coordinated tactics taking a heavy toll on the enemy. But Jake noticed that his human soldiers were fighting differently. They were more aggressive, more willing to take risks. When a position needed to be held, they held it. When a charge needed to be made, they charged. Lieutenant Amy Carter was coordinating the evacuation of civilians to the landing zone. She had organized a convoy using mining vehicles, but the route was under constant attack. When the lead vehicle was disabled by enemy fire, trapping the convoy in the open, Amy made a decision that any logical tactician would call insane. She took 3 soldiers and charged directly at the Scriven position that was pinning them down. They ran through a hail of acid sprays and slashing claws, firing as they moved. Amy reached the enemy fortification and threw her last grenade directly into it. The explosion killed a dozen Scriven and scattered the rest. The convoy was able to move again. Vexral watched from his command position, his scales flickering through colors that indicated confusion and growing respect. These humans fought like they had nothing to lose. They took casualties that would have forced any Thoraxian unit to withdraw, but they kept pushing forward. It was reckless, maybe even stupid, but it was also incredibly effective. The fleet reinforcements arrived 5 hours and 47 minutes after the initial drop. By then, the human and Thoraxian ground forces had eliminated the Scriven threat and evacuated most of the civilians. Jake stood in the ruins of the colony, exhausted and covered in dirt and blood. Around him, his soldiers were tending to their wounded and counting their losses. 83 human soldiers had died. Another 47 were seriously wounded. Out of 200 who had dropped into combat, less than half were still combat effective. The Thoraxian casualties were much lighter, only 12 killed and 20 wounded. Commander Vexral approached Jake, his scales displaying a complex pattern that the human couldn't quite interpret. "Your troops fought with exceptional courage, Captain Morrison. The civilians are safe because of your immediate action." "We lost a lot of good people," Jake replied quietly. "You did. Your casualty rate is 40%. By our standards, that is catastrophically high. No Thoraxian commander would accept such losses for any objective." Jake looked at the Thoraxian commander. "Those 1,200 civilians are alive. My soldiers knew the risks. They chose to take them. But why? The logical approach would have been to wait for support, minimize casualties, and achieve the objective with better odds. Because waiting would have killed everyone down there," Jake said. "Because some things are worth dying for. Because that's what soldiers do. We stand between civilians and danger, no matter the cost." Vexral was silent for a moment. "Your species fights with great heart but little wisdom. You waste lives that could be preserved with better tactics." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "Or maybe we understand something about warfare that doesn't fit into your tactical computers. We'll see." The survivors were loaded onto transports and returned to the Valiant Dawn. The human casualties were treated in the medical bay, where the days following the battle were difficult. The human soldiers mourned their fallen comrades while trying to maintain their duties aboard the Valiant Dawn. The Thoraxians conducted formal recognition ceremonies, acknowledging the courage shown during the rescue operation, but beneath the official respect, Jake could sense a growing tension. The Thoraxian troops had started openly questioning human tactics. During training sessions, they would point out how human approaches violated established military doctrine. They criticized the aggressive charges, the willingness to accept casualties, and what they saw as emotional decision-making. To the Thoraxians, warfare was a science with proven formulas. The humans seemed to ignore all logic in favor of reckless bravery. Private Danny Wright was in the recreation area during his off-duty hours, watching a documentary on his tablet. The video showed historical battles from Earth, focusing on last stands and desperate defenses. Several other human soldiers gathered around to watch with him. They found comfort in these old stories, connecting their recent losses to the long tradition of human warriors who had faced impossible odds. The segment playing was about Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors held a mountain pass against the massive Persian army. The narrator explained how King Leonidas and his men knew they were going to die, but they chose to fight anyway. They held the pass for 3 days, killing thousands of enemy soldiers before finally being overwhelmed. Their sacrifice gave the Greek city-states time to organize their defenses and eventually win the war. A group of young Thracian soldiers had wandered into the recreation area. They stopped to watch the human documentary, their scales shifting to colors that meant curiosity mixed with amusement. As the battle footage played, showing the ancient warriors fighting with spears and shields, the Thracians began making their clicking sounds. The translation units rendered it as laughter. "These are your war heroes?" one Thracian asked, his scales bright with mirth. "Primitive soldiers with hand weapons fighting a battle they knew they would lose?" Danny paused the video. "They're remembered because they sacrificed everything to protect their people. They're heroes because they held the line when no one else could." Another Thracian soldier clicked louder, "But they lost. They all died. How is that heroic? A proper military force would have withdrawn, preserved their troops, and found a better tactical position. This is just waste." "It wasn't waste," Danny replied, his voice getting harder. "They bought time. They showed the enemy that Greeks wouldn't surrender easily. They inspired their entire civilization to keep fighting." The Thracians found this hilarious. Their scales flickered through multiple colors of amusement. "You celebrate military failures? No wonder your species took so long to reach the stars. You spend your time glorifying tactical disasters instead of learning from them." More human soldiers had entered the recreation area, drawn by the commotion. Sergeant Kyle Bennett pushed through the crowd, his jaw tight with anger. He had lost friends in the recent battle, and the mockery felt like an insult to their memory. "You think it's funny?" Kyle said, stepping close to the Thracian who had laughed the loudest. "You think courage and sacrifice are jokes?" The Thracian looked down at Kyle. Even sitting, the alien was taller than the human sergeant. His scale shifted to a dark red that meant aggression. "I think your species confuses stupidity with bravery. There is no honor in throwing lives away for symbolic gestures. War is about victory achieved through superior tactics and technology. Your emotional approach to combat is primitive." Kyle's fists clenched. Several other human soldiers moved closer, forming up behind their sergeant. The Thracians stood as well. And suddenly the recreation area felt very small and very dangerous. Jake heard the commotion from the corridor and rushed in. "Stand down," he ordered. The human soldiers hesitated, looking at Kyle for confirmation. The sergeant took a breath, forcing himself to relax slightly. He stepped back but kept his eyes locked on the Thracian. "This isn't over," Kyle muttered. The Thracians left, still clicking with amusement. Jake could hear them in the corridor, discussing how thin-skinned the humans were, how they couldn't handle honest tactical assessment. The humans remained in the recreation area, angry and frustrated. "Captain, we can't let them disrespect us like that," Amy said quietly. "The troops are losing morale. They feel like everything we did, everyone we lost, means nothing to these aliens." Jake understood. The mockery was worse than the battle wounds. His soldiers could handle physical pain and danger, but having their sacrifices dismissed as stupidity was cutting deeper than any weapon. He needed to address this before it destroyed unit cohesion. That evening, Jake requested a private meeting with Commander Vexral. The Thracian leader received him in his quarters, which were decorated with battle honors and weapons from dozens of campaigns. Vexral's scales were neutral blue, showing professional courtesy. "Captain Morrison, what brings you here?" "Sir, we need to discuss the tensions between our troops. The Thracians are openly mocking human traditions and combat methods. It's creating serious problems for unit cohesion." Vexral's scales flickered slightly. "Mocking? We are simply providing honest tactical analysis. Your troops fought bravely at Theta Centauri, but they also died unnecessarily. We are trying to help you understand more efficient methods. With respect, sir, it's not coming across as help. Your soldiers are laughing at our history, calling our heroes stupid and dismissing our military traditions as primitive." The commander's scales darkened slightly, showing irritation, because from an objective standpoint they are primitive. You celebrate battles where everyone died. You tell stories about hopeless last stands as if defeat was victory. You prioritize emotion over logic in tactical decisions. These are facts, Captain Morrison, not insults. Our traditions work for us, Jake said firmly. They keep morale high. They remind soldiers what they're fighting for. They connect each generation to the warriors who came before. But they also get your soldiers killed at rates we would never accept. 40% casualties in a single engagement? That's not heroic, Captain. That's poor command and reckless tactics. If your troops could separate emotion from logic, they would be more effective and survive longer. Jake felt his own anger rising but kept it controlled. My soldiers saved 1,200 civilians. We did what needed to be done, and lost half your force doing it. A Thraxian commander would have found a way to achieve the same objective with minimal casualties. That is the difference between experienced military force and enthusiastic amateurs. The words stung because there was some truth in them. Jake knew his tactics would never be approved at any military academy. The human approach to warfare was messy and costly, but it also got results when the situation was desperate. How could he explain that to an alien who had never felt what it meant to be human? Sir, I'm just asking that your troops show more respect. We're fighting the same enemy. We should be allies, not antagonists. Vexral's scale shifted through several colors before settling on a dark blue that meant firm decision. Respect is earned through competence and results, Captain. Your troops have shown courage, yes, but courage alone is not enough. They must prove they can operate at the level the Galactic Union requires. Until then, they should expect honest assessment of their performance, whether they find it flattering or not. Jake realized this conversation was going nowhere. The Thraxians saw warfare as a science that they had perfected over centuries. They genuinely believed they were helping humanity by pointing out flaws in their approach. The fact that it felt disrespectful to the humans was irrelevant to them. Understood, sir. Thank you for your time. Jake returned to his troops and tried to address the situation. He gathered the human soldiers in their quarters and spoke to them honestly. They were guests on this ship. They were the new species in a galaxy that had been fighting this war for years. The Thraxians had centuries of military tradition, and humans had to prove themselves worthy of respect. I know it's hard, Jake said, looking at the faces of his soldiers. I know it feels like they're disrespecting everything we've sacrificed. But we can't change their minds with words. We can only show them through our actions. Keep doing your jobs. Keep being the soldiers I know you are. Eventually they'll understand, but even as he said it, Jake wasn't sure he believed it. The cultural gap seemed too wide to bridge. The Thraxians operated on pure logic and tactical doctrine. They had no equivalent to the stories and myths that drove human warriors. How could you explain the power of inspiration to beings who saw emotion as a weakness? The mockery continued over the following weeks. Thraxian soldiers would watch human training exercises and offer unsolicited advice on how to be more efficient. They questioned why humans wasted time on ceremonies honoring fallen soldiers instead of analyzing tactical data to prevent future casualties. They couldn't understand why humans displayed photos of their families, arguing that emotional attachments were distracting during combat operations. The breaking point came during a mixed training exercise. A scenario was set up where a small force needed to hold a position against overwhelming enemy numbers long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Valiant Dawn docked at Starbase Harmony for resupply and crew rotation. The massive station orbited a gas giant, serving as a logistics hub for the entire sector. Ships from dozens of species came and went, carrying troops and supplies to the front lines. Jake was glad for the break from combat operations, though the tension between human and Thraxian troops remained high. Commander Vexral called a briefing to announce that they would be taking on a special passenger. General Crosstar, the most famous warrior in Thraxian history, would be traveling with them to inspect frontline operations. The news sent ripples of excitement through the Thraxian troops. Crosstar was a living legend, the architect of their greatest military victories. Who is this guy? Amy asked Jake quietly. From what I understand, he's like if we combined all our greatest generals into one person. He fought in some 30-year war that almost destroyed the Thraxian homeworld. He personally led the assault that broke the enemy siege. Every Thraxian soldier grows up studying his tactics. Kyle looked skeptical. Great. Another alien who's going to tell us we're doing everything wrong. The general arrived the next day. Jake was part of the honor guard assembled to greet him. When Crossitar walked off the transport, Jake immediately understood why he was legendary. The general was old, his scales faded to pale gray and marked with countless scars. He walked with a noticeable limp, and one of his arms seemed partially crippled. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and he carried himself with quiet authority. Every Thraxian on the station stood at attention. Even Commander Vexral, normally so confident and commanding, seemed nervous in the general's presence. Crossitar acknowledged the salutes with a slight nod and made his way slowly into the ship. He said nothing during the formal reception, simply observing everything with those keen eyes. Over the next week, the general maintained a low profile. He watched training exercises from observation decks. He sat quietly in the mess hall during meals, listening to conversations. He reviewed combat footage from recent engagements. Jake noticed that Crossitar spent a lot of time observing the human troops, which seemed odd. Why would a legendary Thraxian general be interested in the primitive aliens? The general also spent time in the human recreation areas, sitting alone in corners while the soldiers went about their off-duty activities. He watched them watch their historical documentaries. He listened to their stories about past battles. He observed how they interacted with each other, how they honored their dead, how they carried themselves. The human soldiers found it unnerving at first, but eventually they got used to the old Thraxian sitting quietly in the background. Danny was watching another documentary, this one about the Battle of the Alamo. 13 days of siege, a small garrison against an army. Everyone knowing they would die but choosing to fight anyway. Some of the Thraxian soldiers wandered by and started making their clicking sounds again. The mockery had become routine now. More human defeat worship. One young Thraxian said, his scales bright with amusement. Do you have any historical victories, or do you only celebrate when you lose? We have plenty of victories, Danny replied tiredly, but we also remember the sacrifices that made them possible. The Thraxians found this hilarious as usual, but Jake noticed that General Crossitar was in the corner, watching the interaction carefully. The old general's scales were displaying a color Jake had never seen before, something dark and complex. The situation reached its climax during a formal dinner between the command staffs. It was meant to be a social occasion, a chance for officers to relax and build relationships. The dining hall had been decorated, and the food dispensers had been programmed to offer dishes from both Thraxian and human cuisines. Jake sat with Amy and Kyle at a table with several Thraxian officers. General Crossitar sat at the head table with Commander Vexral and the senior staff. The dinner started well enough. Officers from both species made polite conversation, discussing neutral topics like ship operations and logistics. But as the meal progressed and some Thraxian officers consumed their equivalent of alcohol, the atmosphere changed. The Thraxians began telling battle stories, competing with each other to impress their legendary general. One young Thraxian officer, his scales flushed bright colors from drink, decided to entertain the table with a funny story about the primitive humans. He recounted watching their historical documentaries and laughing at their ridiculous traditions. General, you should see what these humans celebrate, the officer said, his words slightly slurred. They have this story about 300 soldiers trying to hold a narrow mountain pass against an entire army. Of course they all died, but humans think this was somehow glorious. 300 against thousands, choosing certain death over retreat. Can you imagine such tactical incompetence? Several Thraxian officers clicked with laughter. Jake felt his jaw tighten. Kyle's hands gripped his utensils hard enough to bend them. This was too much, even for a formal dinner. But before anyone could respond, General Crossitar spoke. I was there. The entire room fell silent. Every scale in the room shifted to confused gray. The young officer who had been telling the story looked like he had been struck. Commander Vexral leaned forward, uncertain if he had heard correctly. General, what do you mean? Vexral asked carefully. Crossitar's ancient eyes turned to look at Jake and the human officers. What is the name of this battle your soldier referenced? Jake stood slowly. Sir, it's called the Battle of Thermopylae. It happened about 2,500 years ago on Earth. King Leonidas led 300 Spartan warriors to hold a mountain pass against the Persian Empire. They all died, but they bought time for Greece to prepare its defense. The general nodded slowly, his scales shifting to deep purple, a color that meant profound emotion. 73 years ago, I was a young officer assigned to an observation post in your sector. The Galactic Union monitors pre-contact civilizations for potential membership. Earth was on our watch list, he paused, and every being in the room hung on his words. The great general rarely spoke at length, so when he did, people listened. I was part of a team studying human warfare capabilities. We wanted to understand if your species had the potential to join the Union. We had dimensional observation technology that allowed us to view your planet without interfering. We watched many of your battles across different time periods to understand how humans approached warfare. Crostar's scales continued to shift through colors. I was assigned to observe this particular battle at Thermopylae because our analysts flagged it as tactically interesting. A small force attempting to hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds. I expected to see standard defensive doctrine, perhaps an orderly retreat when the position became untenable. What I witnessed instead changed my understanding of warfare itself. The room was absolutely silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat. General Crositar, the greatest military mind in Thraxian history, had watched Thermopylae happen. He had seen the ancient Spartans fight and die. I have observed thousands of battles across hundreds of species, Crostar continued. I have studied warfare for over 3 centuries. I thought I understood courage, sacrifice, and tactical thinking. But those 3 days at that narrow pass taught me something new. He looked directly at the young officer who had been mocking the story. You laugh because they lost. You think victory is the only measure of military success. You are wrong, and your ignorance shames you. The young officer's scales went pale with horror. To be rebuked by General Crostar was a devastating blow to any Thraxian soldier's honor. Those 300 warriors knew they would die, Crostar said, his voice carrying weight that came from absolute authority. King Leonidas sent them not because they could win, but because they would lose in a way that mattered. They were a message written in blood. They told an empire that counted its soldiers in millions that even in defeat, Greeks would extract a terrible price. The general's scales shifted to nearly black, a color none of them had seen before. I watched those warriors fight for 3 days. They were offered surrender and refused. They were offered escape routes and refused. When they were down to their last few dozen men, wounded and exhausted, they still maintained formation. They fought with broken weapons. They fought with their bare hands. When the last Spartan fell, the Persians had lost thousands of their best troops and gained nothing but a road paved with their own dead. Jake felt something in his chest tighten. To hear this ancient battle described by someone who had actually witnessed it was overwhelming. Around the room, the human soldiers sat transfixed. I filed my report with the Union Council. Crostar continued. I told them that humanity was a species we should watch carefully. Not because of your technology, which was primitive, or your numbers, which were limited to one world, but because you possess something I had never fully understood before. You called it the human spirit in my report, though that translation does not capture its full meaning. He turned to address the entire assembly. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not stupid. They were not victims of poor command. They were transcendent. They understood something that we Thraxians, with all our... The days following General Crostar's revelation transformed life aboard the Valiant Dawn. The mockery stopped immediately. The Thraxian soldiers began approaching their human counterparts with genuine curiosity instead of condescension. They asked about Earth's history, about famous battles, about the traditions that shaped human warriors. The cultural gap remained, but now there was a bridge of understanding. Commander Vexral personally apologized to Jake for his previous dismissiveness. I viewed your tactics through purely logical analysis, he admitted, his scales displaying humble purple. I failed to understand the psychological and cultural elements that make human warriors effective. General Crostar has taught me that there are forms of strength that cannot be measured by casualty rates or tactical efficiency. Jake accepted the apology with grace. He understood that the Thraxians had been operating on incomplete information. They had centuries of military doctrine built on logic and proven methods. Human warfare, with its emphasis on inspiration and sacrifice, seemed inefficient from their perspective. It took someone like Crostar, who had witnessed humanity's unique approach firsthand, to explain the deeper truth. Training exercises became collaborative rather than competitive. When Kyle's squad ran their last stand scenario again, the Thraxian observers watched with new appreciation. They began to understand that the human willingness to hold impossible positions was not stupidity, but calculated psychological warfare. An enemy who knows their opponents will never retreat must commit overwhelming force to every engagement. That changes the mathematics of war. Your approach creates strategic uncertainty, a Thraxian tactical officer explained to Amy during a planning session. If the enemy cannot predict when you will withdraw, they must always assume you will fight to the last soldier. This forces them to commit more resources than necessary, slowing their overall advance. Amy smiled. We never thought of it in those terms, but yes. When you fight like every battle might be your Thermopylae, the enemy learns to fear you. General Crostar spent several weeks aboard the Valiant Dawn, observing and occasionally offering insights. He spoke little, but when he did, everyone listened. He shared stories from his long career, pointing out situations where Thraxian forces might have benefited from a more human approach. He also candidly discussed battles where human-style tactics would have been disastrous, helping the human officers understand when to use their aggressive instincts and when to exercise restraint. One evening, Jake found the general alone in an observation deck, watching the stars slide past in hyperspace. He had learned that Crostar valued these quiet moments, and the general seemed to welcome Jake's company. Sir, may I ask you something? Of course, Captain. When you watched Thermopylae happen, did you know then that humanity would eventually reach the stars? Crositar's scales shifted thoughtfully. I suspected. A species that could create such warriors, that could inspire such sacrifice, would not remain confined to one world. You were too stubborn to stay in one place forever. He paused. I am old, Captain Morrison. I have seen many things, but in all my years I have never met another species quite like humanity. You burn bright and fast. Your lives are short compared to most Galactic Union species, but you pack them full of meaning and passion. Is that a strength or weakness? Both, Crostar replied honestly. You will take risks other species would never consider. You will sacrifice for causes that others would abandon. This makes you invaluable in desperate situations, but it also means you will suffer casualties that would break other military forces. The key is learning when to burn bright and when to conserve your fire. Jake thought about the soldiers he had lost at Theta Centauri. We're still learning, as are we all. Warfare evolves, Captain. Every species brings something unique to the Galactic Union military. Humans bring courage that borders on madness and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The galaxy is stronger for having you in it. The general's words spread through both human and Thraxian ranks. The Valiant Dawn became a model of interspecies cooperation, and other ships began requesting joint assignments with human troops. The reputation of Captain Morrison's battalion grew beyond their ship. They were the humans who fought like ancient warriors, the soldiers who turned every battle into a legend. 6 weeks after Crostar's revelation, the Valiant Dawn received orders to join a major fleet operation. The Scriven had launched a massive offensive against the industrial world of New Harmony. The planet produced 40% of the sector's military supplies. If it fell, the entire front line would collapse. Every available ship was being committed to its defense. The briefing room was packed with officers from a dozen species. The tactical situation was dire. The Scriven had numerical superiority and had already landed ground forces on 3 continents. The Galactic Union fleet would arrive simultaneously with major Scriven reinforcements. The battle would determine the fate of the sector. Our objective is to break through the Scriven blockade and establish orbital control, the fleet admiral explained. Ground forces will deploy to eliminate enemy positions on the planet's surface. This will be the largest engagement of the war so far. We expect heavy casualties across all units. Jake studied the tactical display with Amy and Kyle. The Scriven had dug in deep, using New Harmony's own defensive installations against the Union. It would be brutal urban combat, exactly the kind of grinding battle where the Scriven's numerical advantage mattered most. This is going to be bad, Kyle muttered. They've had weeks to prepare positions. We'll be assaulting fortified enemies with no element of surprise. Then we do what we do best, Jake replied. We hit them hard and don't stop until the job is done. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Dozens of ships appeared simultaneously, their weapons already charged and targeting solutions calculated. The Scriven fleet responded immediately and space erupted in fire. Energy beams and missiles crossed the distance between fleets at relativistic speeds. Ships exploded, shields failed, and the dance of death began. The Valiant Dawn took hits but stayed in formation. Commander Vexral commanded the ship with steady precision, coordinating with other vessels to create overlapping fields of fire. The human and Thraxian boarding teams prepared for deployment, checking weapons and armor one last time. General Crostar appeared in the deployment bay, wearing combat armor that looked ancient but well-maintained. Jake was surprised to see him. "Sir, you're deploying with us?" "I am too old to sit in observation rooms while warriors fight," Crostar replied. "Besides, I want to see how humans fight in person, not through monitoring equipment." The drop to New Harmony was even worse than Theta Centauri. The Scriven had anti-air weapons positioned across the drop zones. Pods were destroyed before reaching the ground. Jake's pod slammed into a building, the emergency systems barely keeping him alive. He crawled out of the wreckage into a war zone. The city was burning. Scriven forces were everywhere, using the buildings and streets to create killing zones. Civilian casualties were already catastrophic. Jake rallied his scattered troops, establishing communication and forming defensive perimeters. The Thraxians deployed nearby, their disciplined formations providing stable anchor points. The battle was everything Jake had feared. Urban combat favored the defenders, and the Scriven used every advantage. They collapsed buildings, flooded streets with acid, and attacked from unexpected angles. The Union forces pushed forward slowly, paying for every block in blood. But something was different this time. The Thraxian troops fought differently alongside the humans. They had learned from watching human tactics. When a position needed to be held at all costs, Thraxian soldiers volunteered to stay behind with human defenders. When a desperate charge needed to be made, mixed teams of humans and Thraxians went together. Amy led a combined force to secure a civilian shelter that was under attack. The Scriven had breached the outer defenses and were trying to break through to where thousands of people were hiding. Amy's assault was pure aggression, charging straight into the enemy position with no regard for cover or safety. But this time Thraxian soldiers charged with her, their energy weapons cutting paths through the enemy while human soldiers exploited the openings. Kyle found himself fighting alongside a Thraxian warrior named Zektar. The alien had asked Kyle to teach him about human close combat techniques. Now they moved as a team, Kyle's aggressive charges supported by Zektar's precise firepower. They cleared an entire building complex together, saving a group of civilians who had been trapped for days. Jake pushed toward the primary Scriven command center with a mixed force of 50 humans and 50 Thraxians. The enemy had established themselves in the city's central tower, using its height to coordinate their forces. Taking it would be suicide. Everyone knew it, but it had to be done. "This is it," Jake said to his assembled troops. "This is our Thermopylae. This is where we show the galaxy what we're made of." The Thraxian soldiers understood now. Their scales showed determination mixed with respect. They had learned what those words meant. This would be a last stand if necessary, a battle where survival was secondary to completing the mission.